With the end of the American Revolution in 1783 came the birth of a new and independent nation which relied on its own government to form laws by which the country and its citizens must abide by. An official document was needed to record these laws, and that document would become the United States Constitution. Created in 1789, the Constitution's principles were absolute, the highest law in the land. Such a weighty document must be preserved and its laws upheld, which called for the Judiciary Act of 1789. This act established the Supreme Court, which would consist of a Chief Justice, 5 associates, and federal courts with the job of enforcing the laws laid down by the Constitution. However, this act did not establish the Supreme Court as the ultimate authority on decisions dealing or questioning the Constitution, an issue that arose in the landmark case of Marbury v. Madison. In this case, John Marshall, appointed Chief Justice by Adams, won the ruling that the power to determine the meaning of the Constitution should be given to the Supreme Court by principle of judicial review, which held that the Supreme Court has the last word on questions of constitutionality. The decision of Marbury v. Madison gave immense power to the Supreme Court and established it as the guardian of the American legal system and the Constitution. This new authority of the court was put to the test in McCulloch v. Maryland in 1819, in which Maryland tried to destroy the Bank of the United States by imposing in it certain taxes. The Supreme Court ruled that the bank was constitutional on the basis of implied powers, thus asserting federal authority and creating the concept of loose construction, which allowed a less strict interpretation of the Constitution. Such cases as Marbury v. Madison and McCulloch v. Maryland set the tempo for the power of not only the court system but of the entire federal government as a whole, which can be seen in the later Gibbons v. Ogden. This case ruled that, according to the Constitution, the power to regulate interstate commerce was given solely to Congress, not individual states. This decision was reiterated in the Wabash case in 1886, which established the Interstate Commerce Commission to administer and enforce the same legislation that was provided in Gibbons v. Ogden. The issue over state versus federal powers was a long-debated issue in the Supreme Court, and its ruling shaped American policy to be more supportive of power to the federal government in various areas of legislation. This trend can be seen as well in Fletcher v. Peck, 1810, in which a Georgia legislature, by fraudulent means, granted 35 million acres of land in Mississippi to private speculators. The state then canceled this deal, but the Supreme Court ruled that the Constitution prohibits state laws that impair contracts, thus dealing another blow to the power of individual states. How it may seem that the Supreme Court cases of American history affected American policy towards state versus federal powers, there were other such cases that shaped American labor. With the rapid industrialization of American society during the 19th century, the relationship between employees and employers became complex and strained, leading to a need for organized labor unions to seek benefits, and so on. The Supreme Court case, Commonwealth v. Hunt, addressed the question over legality of such labor unions and ruled that they were not illegal conspiracies as long as they used honorable and peaceful methods. This decision legalized the formation of labor unions and therefore molded American policy towards labor for the next century, one in which the rise of labor unions formed a pivotal part of American industry. Another nation-changing case was in March of 1857 when a black slave by the name of Dred Scott tried to sue for his freedom on the basis that he had resided on free soil with his master for an extended period of time. The Supreme Court case ruled that since Scott was a black slave and therefore not a citizen, so he could not sue in federal court. This case led to attempts to solve and satiate the issue over slavery and define the actions that the government would take towards these solutions, such as the Missouri Compromise, and so on. Another issue faced by the Supreme Court legislation was the authority and legality of the government to suppress civil liberties in times of war. This conflict, present in the Schenck v. U.S. case, was ruled that freedom of speech could be revoked if and when it posed a clear and present danger to the nation. This decision augmented the power that the federal government possessed over the people, and in turn altered American policy towards civil liberties. This infringement upon the rights of the people continued to be a wartime issue, as it can be seen in the Supreme Court case Korematsu v. U.S., 1944, which took place in response to the Japanese bombings at Pearl Harbor during World War II. The court ruled in this case that it was not against the Constitution to relocate Japanese American citizens to internment camps, resulting in the uprooting of thousands of American citizens
loss of millions of dollars in property and earnings, and the denial of basic rights as citizens of the United States. This case reinforced the new American policy that it is acceptable to suppress civil liberties during times of war or when such liberties pose a threat to the nation's.
After the issue of slavery had been settled by the Civil War, the issue over black equality still remained at large, if not significantly grown. Into the civil rights movement of the 20th century, the decisions of the Supreme Court continued to reflect the country's policy towards blacks, whereas in the pre-Civil War era they had concerns over their freedom. The decisions they had were now over their equality. In 1896 arose a case, Plessy v. Ferguson, which ruled that separate equal facilities were legal under the Constitution, essentially legalizing segregation and hindering process for African American equality. The tables were turned, however, when in 1954 the court ruled that segregation in schools was inherently unequal and called for the desegregation of public schools in Brown v. Board of Education. This crucial verdict drastically turned the ideas of government policy towards black rights and presented a long road towards equality. However, the issue of desegregation in school traveled in the other direction. Representative in the Bach case, where Alan Bach claimed that he was denied admission into UC Davis on the ground that they favored minority groups. This problem divided the Supreme Court, which ultimately stated that admission could not be on the basis of ethnicity or race alone. But such factors could be taken into account in order to produce a diverse student body.
Another critical issue was taken into account during the same time period, the debate over the constitutionality of abortion. In 1973, as part of Roe v. Wade, the court prohibited states from passing laws that interfered with a woman's right to have an abortion. This illustrates how the U.S.'s policy towards abortion is one of upholding privacy, but this was somewhat countered in Planned Parenthood v. Casey, 1992, in which the judgment was that states could restrict access to abortion if it did not place an undue burden on the woman, thus allowing states to pass certain standards and conditions on abortion. The decision made over the course of history by the Supreme Court have reflected and sometimes shaped American policy towards the various issues represented in their cases. While some of these verdicts may have been and continue to be conflicting, the legislation of the Supreme Court has been a vital part of the country's development as well as the preservation of the basic laws that founded it.